Before Netflix, before Hulu, before YouTube, before streaming services, DVRs, and on-demand entertainment, there was a time when television was an event. Not a recommendation, not a playlist, not something you watched whenever you felt like it. An event. Millions of people gathered in front of their televisions at the same time to watch the same program. The next morning, everyone talked about it. In school, at work, at church, at the grocery store. For a brief moment, the entire country shared the same experience. Today, that kind of television is almost impossible to imagine. We're surrounded by thousands of channels and streaming platforms. Everyone watches something different. But in the 1980s, television miniseries and special presentations could stop the nation in its tracks. Tonight, we're looking back at some of the biggest television events of the 1980s and exploring what made them so important. For younger viewers, it's difficult to explain just how different television was. There was no streaming. There was no on-demand viewing. There was no binge watching. If you missed something, you missed it. You waited for a rerun, or hoped someone recorded it on a VHS tape. That created a very different relationship between audiences and television. Networks promoted these productions for weeks or even months before they aired. Commercials appeared constantly. Magazines covered them. Newspapers discussed them. And anticipation built. When the show finally aired, everyone tuned in together. It felt like attending a national event. One thing that's difficult to explain to younger audiences is that watching television used to require planning. You couldn't simply decide at 10 o'clock at night that you wanted to start a series everyone was talking about. You had to be there when the show aired. Families checked TV Guide. People discussed upcoming broadcasts for weeks. VCRs were programmed carefully because a mistake meant missing the show completely. That scarcity created value. When something special was airing, you made time for it. Today, content waits for us. Back then, we waited for content. That may sound inconvenient, but it also made television feel more important. One of the most significant television events of the decade was the day after. The premise was simple. What would happen if nuclear war broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union? The answer was terrifying. The film followed ordinary Americans before, during, and after a nuclear exchange. Unlike most science fiction productions, there was no hero saving the day. There was no last-minute solution, only consequences. For many people, the day after wasn't entertainment, it was an experience. The movie sparked discussions in households across America. Parents talked to their children, politicians discussed it, news organizations covered public reaction. For a brief period, the entire nation was asking the same question. Could this actually happen? That's the kind of impact television events could have. If the day after was disturbing, Threads was devastating. Produced by the BBC, Threads showed what nuclear war might look like from the perspective of ordinary people living in Sheffield, England. The movie followed society from normal daily life into complete collapse. What made Threads unique was its willingness to look beyond the explosions. It showed famine, disease, social collapse, the breakdown of government, generational decline. Many viewers considered it one of the most frightening television productions ever made. Even today, Threads remains difficult to watch, not because of special effects, but because of its realism. Not every television event was about nuclear war. Some were about aliens. Few miniseries generated more excitement than V. The premise was brilliant. Massive alien spacecraft arrive above the world's major cities. The visitors appear friendly. They promise peace. They offer technology. They claim they want to help humanity. There's just one problem. They're lying. Underneath their human appearance are reptilian creatures with very different plans. The arrival of the visitors became one of the defining science fiction moments of the decade. Red uniforms, resistance fighters, giant motherships. For many viewers, V felt like a blockbuster movie unfolding in the living room. Looking back, V succeeded because it combined several genres. It was science fiction, political drama, resistance story, action-adventure. The aliens were interesting, but the real story was about people. Who do you trust? What happens when familiar institutions stop protecting citizens? How do ordinary people respond when freedom is threatened? The science fiction concepts were exciting. The human drama made the story memorable. It's easy to forget that many of these productions were marketed like major motion pictures. Networks spent enormous amounts of money promoting them. Television commercials ran constantly. Magazine covers featured cast members. Newspapers discussed upcoming broadcasts weeks before they aired. For many viewers, these miniseries felt every bit as important as the biggest movies released in theaters. Sometimes they felt even bigger, because unlike a movie that reached hundreds of people in a theater, these productions reached millions of viewers simultaneously. For one evening, everyone was experiencing the same story together. If V reflected fears of invasion, Amerika reflected Cold War anxieties. Starring Chris Christopherson, the miniseries imagined a future where the United States had fallen under Soviet influence. Unlike traditional invasion stories, the takeover wasn't presented through massive military battles. Instead, it was gradual, political, cultural. The series asked a frightening question. What happens when people slowly lose freedoms they've always taken for granted? At the time, this resonated strongly with audiences living through the Cold War. Today, it remains an interesting time capsule of one of the most tense periods in modern history. Not every television event involved science fiction or war. Shogun proved audiences would also embrace large-scale historical storytelling. Based on James Clavell's best-selling novel, Shogun introduced millions of viewers to feudal Japan. The production was massive, the story was epic, the characters were compelling. For many people, the miniseries became their first exposure to Japanese history and culture. It demonstrated the power of television to transport audiences to places and times they might never otherwise experience. Ask someone who grew up in the 1980s where they were when a major miniseries aired, and there's a good chance they'll remember. Not necessarily every plot detail, but they'll remember the room, the people watching with them, the conversations afterward. Television became part of family history. Today, entertainment is often consumed individually. Back then, it was frequently consumed collectively. That created memories that extended beyond the programs themselves. Another major television event was North and South. Set during the years leading up to the American Civil War, the miniseries followed two families from very different regions of the country. The combination of historical drama, romance, politics, war made it enormously popular. People didn't simply watch it, they anticipated it. Networks understood how to build excitement. The entire experience felt larger than ordinary television. One of the most ambitious miniseries of the era was Winds of War. This massive production explored the years leading up to World War II. Its sequel, War and Remembrance, expanded the story even further. These productions demonstrated something that television is often reluctant to attempt today: patience. Stories could unfold across multiple nights. Characters could develop slowly. Audiences were willing to invest time. Modern streaming often encourages audiences to consume everything immediately. Miniseries events required viewers to wait, and somehow that waiting made the experience feel bigger. Looking back, I think something interesting happened when television became available on demand. We gained convenience, we gained choice, we gained flexibility. Those are wonderful things, but we also lost something: shared experiences. In the 1980s, millions of people watched the same program at the same time. The next day, everyone knew what everyone else had seen. The conversation started automatically. Today, it's entirely possible for two television fans to subscribe to 5 streaming services and never watch the same show. The audience became fragmented. Greater choice created fewer communal experiences. The 1980s represented a golden age for the television miniseries. Networks discovered that audiences were willing to commit to larger stories if the payoff was worthwhile. Unlike weekly television, writers weren't required to make the story last forever. Unlike movies, they weren't confined to 2 hours. The format allowed stories room to breathe. Characters could develop naturally, relationships could evolve, worlds could be explored in greater depth. Some of the most ambitious storytelling of the decade occurred on television rather than in movie theaters. That may surprise people today, but it was absolutely true. One of the reasons these productions are remembered decades later is that they became cultural moments. People remember where they watched them, who they watched them with, what they thought afterward. The shows became part of a shared memory. That's difficult to replicate in the streaming era. Not impossible, just different. The relationship between television and audiences has changed dramatically. The miniseries of the 1980s demonstrated what television was capable of accomplishing. They weren't simply trying to fill airtime, they took risks, explored difficult subjects, introduced ambitious ideas, and trusted viewers to stay engaged. Some addressed nuclear war, political oppression, alien invasion, cultural conflict, historical events. Others simply told compelling stories, but all of them aimed higher than ordinary weekly television. That's why they continued to be remembered. Sometimes I wonder whether we'll ever see another era like this, an era where tens of millions of people gather at the same time to watch a special television presentation. Streaming has changed everything. Our viewing habits are different, our expectations are different, but every once in a while a major event still breaks through, and when it does, it reminds us of those earlier years when television wasn't simply content. It was an occasion. There's a reason titles like V, Shogun, The Day After, Threads, North and South, Amerika continue to be remembered decades after they aired. The reason isn't nostalgia alone, the reason is impact. These productions weren't simply filling a programming schedule, they demanded attention, they generated discussion, they became part of the cultural conversation. That's what separates entertainment from an event. People may forget individual episodes of long-running television series, they rarely forget experiences that were shared by millions. The television events of the 1980s were more than shows, they were shared experiences. Whether it was The Day After, Threads, V, Amerika, Shogun, North and South, millions of viewers experienced them together, and that may be what makes them so memorable. Not just the stories, the community. The feeling that for a few hours everyone was watching the same thing. Perhaps that's what we've lost in the age of streaming, and perhaps that's why these television events remain so special. So what television miniseries do you remember most from the 1980s? Did I miss one of your favorites? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip back to a time before streaming, before binge watching, and before endless choices, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me next time as we continue exploring the entertainment, technology, and stories that shaped our lives. Until next time, thanks for watching.